Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello everyone, welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. Pardon the frog in my throat, Christmas time, you understand. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and joining me today is Stan Gordan, who is a UFO investigator and researcher in Pennsylvania, and he's been doing this for about 52 years, and we're going to talk about some of his findings in the Pennsylvania area. We're going to talk a little bit about Bigfoot, if there's a connection between the Bigfoot and UFO phenomena. And he's been on many lectures before, and he's recently got a couple of books out, one of them called Silent Invasion, and the other one, Really Mysterious Pennsylvania, that I've got links to on my front page. If y'all are interested in them during the show, just, give them a click, or after the show, give them a click. It'll take you right to the Amazon page, which we're going to discuss his website, which, in fact, before I get carried away, I'll put that out here right now. It's www.stangordan.info, which you can learn more about him and his books there as well. And I believe he's also got some information on there, UFO articles and stuff of that nature. So, Stan, how are you doing today?
We're doing pretty good here. Royce, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing fine over here. It had a wonderful Christmas, filled up my little gillet and gained a few pounds, the usual.
Oh, yeah, well, I had fun doing that as well.
Well, listen, I'm really just now starting to, learn a little bit about you. I've heard your name from time to time. I've seen you on UFO shows on the History Channel, I think, and a few other things, but I think this is my first time to actually, speak to you and get to know you a little better. So I'm hoping to learn a little bit, talking to you tonight. I know you were telling me that you still handle investigations up there in Pennsylvania, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, I started a long time ago, back in 1959 when I was 10 years old. And coincidentally, how I started this was my birthday's during the Halloween season. And on my 10th birthday, my parents gave me a new AM radio. And I was tuning around the AM radio band, and because of the Halloween season, they were talking about flying saucers, ghosts, haunted houses, strange creatures, and I was quite curious when I was a youngster, and after hearing that radio information, I decided to go to the local library and to read all the books they had on the subjects. And I got more interested. I began to watch the newspapers, and I cut articles up, made scrapbooks. And if I heard of any strange events happening locally, I called the people on the telephone and talked to them, and I would keep records of those events. And I was 16 years old when the incident happened near Kecksburg, PA, which you may have heard about. Some people out there call it the Eastern Roswell, or Roswell the East, or there's different names people have given it. But that was the case that started me on my probably, lifetime pursuit of the UFO phenomenon and other mysteries. And even today, after 46 years, we just had the 46th anniversary of the case, December 9th of 65 is when it happened, that I still on occasion get some input on that case. And after that, I began to go out into the field and to investigate cases firsthand. In the late 1960s, I got involved with a group of research people. It's called UFO Research Institute of Pittsburgh. It was a small group of research people. There were some scientists and engineers from Westinghouse Research and other professionals, and they set up a UFO hotline for people to report information, and I became their telephone sighting coordinator, report coordinator. So if a call would come in, it'd come to me, and I would make a determination if the case warranted a further investigation. And in 1969, I set up my own hotline for the public to report UFO sightings, and I began to make contact with the local news media and the police departments and talk them about what I was doing. And, of course, back in those days, there was a lot of ridicule on these subjects, and try to get the point across I was taking this very seriously and be very objective to this information, and asked them if they got any calls, so they at least let people know that I was out there and have them give me a ring. And it wasn't long after my phone was ringing day and night. There were calls coming in about not just UFOs, but all kind of phenomena, ghosts and hauntings and strange footprints and strange creatures, and it became much more than I could handle on my own. And it was my determination to set up a quick response type of team of research people to to evaluate these reports. I knew to properly analyze the data coming in that I needed scientists and technicians, engineers, people with the backgrounds to evaluate what was going on, and that's what I did. So in 1970, I founded the first of 3 volunteer research groups, and that first group was called the Westmoreland County UFO Study Group. And we set up, training programs and how to interview people, how to go out in the field and gather physical evidence. With my electronics background, we set up quite an elaborate communications center in my home, and I set up a 2-way radio dispatch system so we could radio dispatch some of the investigators out to the scene of the events. And over the years, we investigated hundreds of cases.
Wow.
And the reason I'm giving you some background is because this was leading up to this massive wave of events that began to unfold in 1973.
Okay.
So our first group, again, started in 1970. So by 1973, while we first started out more locally and in the greater Pittsburgh area for reports, by the time 1973 rolled around, the group became very well known across the state of Pennsylvania. And we were getting calls from throughout the state. And we had quite a lot of people involved in the investigation. And we would look into these cases the best we could out of our own time and pocket. We had no funding, of course. I was pretty much funding it out of my pocket. And but we were getting calls at that point even from some of the police departments and news media. And so a lot of people out there knew if there was something to report, it found our way to us that somebody could look into these reports. So 1973, and your listeners who may be interested in UFOs and have been for a while, they'll recall that in the fall of 1973, we had that major wave of UFO activity that went on throughout the United States. That went on for weeks and months. It was front page of newspapers, on radio and TV for many, many days back in those times. But here in Pennsylvania, it started the first day of January, and it continued all year long up to the last day of the year. There were hundreds and hundreds of cases, many of them, many of the better cases, which I discuss in the book Solid Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot case book that you had mentioned. And a lot of these were not just lights in the sky, but they were very detailed, very close range of large structured craft, objects pursuing cars, hovering low off the ground, reported landings, just some amazing stories and cases we investigated during that time. And in lots of these reports, we were able to get an investigator or team of investigators out to the scene sometimes within minutes to hours after it occurred, which is what we tried to do. So we could be there when the information was fresh in the mind of the observers. We could observe their reactions and their emotions. We could check for physical evidence. And that's what it was all about. So we had all these UFO sightings going on. But that year became much more interesting as we got into the summer. And what began in the summer of 73 was this massive wave of Bigfoot sightings that happened over a widespread area, mainly concentrated in southwest Pennsylvania over numerous counties, but also in other parts of the state as well. And it was an amazing time to live through. And how it all began, I got a phone call on August the 7th from a relative of a person who had an experience, lived out in a rural area outside of Greensburg, and it was a relatively warm time of the year, as I recall. And the man was shaving that night, getting ready to go to work, which he did early in the morning, so he shaved the night before, and everything was normal. But all of a sudden, he began to smell this funny odor, he said. It was like rotten cucumber. And he turned around, for whatever reason, to look at the bathroom window. And here in the window are these 2 large glowing red eyes staring at him. But the window is 8 feet off the ground.
Wow.
And
that sounds scary.
There's dogs out there. I'm sorry?
That sounds scary.
But there's dogs out in the back, and the dogs aren't barking at all, which is unusual because anybody comes in the area not familiar with, they bark and carry on quite a bit. So he ran out into the other room, and a couple of the other people in the home, they came in the room, they could smell the odor, but whatever was in the window was gone. Well, he had a medical condition. He was taken to the hospital the next day, and when he got back, I got a call on August 7th, he had returned home. So that actually occurred on July 31st, the event. So I went out that day to interview him and the family, and I talked to him quite a while, seemed very, very sincere, still very disturbed over what had occurred. And I learned out there at that time that a number of the local boys had been taking a shortcut over to the local mall. And there was a lot of brush and woods around there at the time, and they heard some commotion, and they thought it was a deer. So they began to throw some stones into the brush, and instead of a deer coming out, here comes this very large, hair-covered, tall creature with long arms swinging, crossing the road, going up the hill behind the house. So I got to talk to some of the boys that day, and I asked the people on the property if they mind if I went up and looked around up the hill behind the house, and they said sure. And some of the young boys asked if they could follow me up the hill, and I said, sure you can, if it's okay with them. And we went up, we looked over the area, and was out for quite a while, nothing odd. Ground conditions weren't real good up there. And I'm just about to leave when I happen to look down, and here on the ground is a very strange footprint. The ground wasn't very good except for really one complete track where it happened, luckily, but here's this footprint, which is 13 inches long and 8 inches long, 13 inches long, 8 inches wide, but it's three-toed. And a very distinct footprint. I got on the radio, called one of my associates. He came out. We took photographs and measurements and made a plaster Paris casting of the footprint. And the kids were all amazed, like, what could make something like that? And they were, a little shook up. And while we're out there in the field, we get a radio call that one of our investigators up north of Pittsburgh, now that's almost towards the Ohio line, not far from there, that same morning was investigating a case where a tall, hairy creature with glowing eyes was looking in the window 9 feet off the ground. The police had some strange footprints up there they were investigating. So this started out this massive wave of events that went on for weeks and months over a widespread area. And it was an amazing, amazing time to live through. I was out there in many cases within minutes after some of the events happened, some of the UFO or Bigfoot encounters occurred. And in some cases, he had more than one creature. In many cases, he had multiple eyewitnesses. In lots of cases, he had various types of physical evidence at the scene, such as trails of footprints or other types of physical evidence. It was very interesting. What was probably the most convincing evidence that I saw, other investigators saw, and even some of the police officers who investigated some of the cases back at that time, was something that could not be fabricated. And that was how the animals in the area reacted to when these creatures were nearby. Now, and it was most common in the dogs, but cattle, horses, cats, they would react very odd also when these things were close by. But with the dogs, when these creatures were in the distance, they would bark and carry on tremendously. But in most cases, when they got very close, even the most ferocious dogs were just like stopped in their tracks. They were like paralyzed in fear. They would shake, they would shiver, they wouldn't bark. Sometimes they wouldn't even act right for a day or two later, wouldn't even eat properly. And it was just an amazing sight when these creatures were close by. And that's something that could not have been fabricated. And so all these reports were going on for many, many weeks. This started again in, like I said, in the summer of that year, but it continued into 1974. It was not as active as it was during, the rest of 1973. And a lot of these sightings were daylight sightings, believe it or not, and many of them at extremely close range. And it was just amazing, the detail of the reports, the widespread area. And as we went into these cases now, of course, historically, there had been some history of Bigfoot encounters in Pennsylvania. I started getting some reports in the late 1960s of people who reportedly had encountered some of these creatures. One of the first cases I looked into happened down in a swampy area near Lover, PA, West Newton, PA, where a group of people claimed they came across a large, white, hairy creature down in that area. And so I always went into these reports very open-mindedly and felt that if these were legitimate creature reports, then it may well be, as others have theorized, that we're dealing with some type of unknown primate, some unknown type of zoological specimen. And
makes
this
sense.
outbreak is going to... I'm sorry?
No, I just said it makes sense.
So as 73 as we're going along, as these cases are unfolding, that was, of course, the main theory, what was going on. But as reports began to come in, and again, a lot of these calls are coming in initially to the police departments, to the news media, and then we were getting reports. And the calls are coming in from a lot of very, very upset people, frightened people, people who just wanted to figure out, like, what is going on out here, because they've never had encountered such things, and most people would never have believed that such things could exist until they had their own personal experiences. But anyhow, some of the reports began to get much more unusual and much more interesting. One of the first reports we had was from a rural area from the wife of a prominent doctor. This particular evening, she had seen this large boomerang-shaped object hovering over the area. And then a few hours later, she was hearing gunshots pretty close right down the street, and found out later that the neighbor went out in the yard to see what was causing his dog to be very upset out there. And here's this large, hairy creature going after the dog, chasing the woods, and the man starts shooting at the creature. So we thought, well, that's pretty interesting. You know, you've got a UFO, and then you've got a Bigfoot in the same area, you know, with a relatively short time after that. And as weeks and months went by, we began to get more and more cases where, for example, you'd have a UFO sighting in a particular area, and then a short time later you have a Bigfoot sighting, or vice versa. Then some of the reports got even more intriguing. Case in September of '73, north of Pittsburgh, there was two young ladies waiting for a friend to pick them up out in the country up there, and here's this large white hairy covered creature taking long strides, going across the road into the woods. And seeing the creature alone was very mystifying, but in one of its hand, it had a small glowing sphere of light that it was carrying. So they ran over and told the father, one of the guys that owned the property, where the creature went into the woods, told him what happened. He went down, started looking around, and while he was down there, this object comes across the sky and slows down and projects a beam of light down into the woods. And then things got more and more interesting with other cases of UFOs and Bigfoot being seen together. The classic case, and one that's been receiving a lot of international interest, and I read the whole complete story up in the Silent Invasion book, and would just touch on it. It gets stranger and stranger, and we could talk for hours just about this case. But
okay.
just to give you a preview of the event, this occurred October 25th, 1973, up in Fayette County. And Fayette County is along the Chestnut Ridge, and the Chestnut Ridge is a mountain range that runs about 100 miles long from Preston County, West Virginia, through Westmoreland, Fayette, and Indiana County in southwest Pennsylvania. But it's a hotbed for strange phenomena. I mean, there's been a long history of a lot of things going on along the ridge. UFO sightings, strange creature reports, underground sounds, just all kind of mysterious events year after year almost that we get strange phenomena along that Chestnut Ridge area. But this happened again outside of Uniontown, and I got a call at 10:30 that night of this event from the state trooper that just came back from investigating this multiple witness UFO landing with two Bigfoot creatures in the pasture field at the same time. And I talked to the state trooper. One of the key witnesses was at the barracks at the time. I talked to him, and the trooper himself seemed a little shook up, and he kind of suggested we should get an investigating team up there as soon as we could, because he felt that there might be something still up there. So we were a pretty good distance away, and it was already late at night, but we did get our team together. We got a number of fellows together. We got our equipment checked out and got our tape recorders and radiation meters and all our equipment, and we made our way up there. We got up there early in the morning hours, and what we found out was that about 9 o'clock that evening, about 15 people in that small rural community out there, they observed this object, which they described as big as a barn. It was a big round object, red, and it was about 100 feet off the ground, kind of hovering and slowly making its way down towards the pasture. So this happened again. The farmer's son, this was actually on his dad's farm, was out in the area at the time, and he saw this thing coming down. He went up to a neighbor's house, got a different perspective to look and see this thing as it was coming down, and he and two of the neighbor boys decided to go up to investigate. So he went over to his dad's farm first and grabbed 30-06, and he grabbed some live ammo, and there was also 2 tracers. And now in the distance, as they're slowly moving towards that area, they're hearing a number of different sounds. You hear dogs going crazy in the distance. They're hearing like a high-pitched whining sound. They're hearing baby crying sounds in the distance. And as they get closer, these sounds are getting louder. So they work their way up to the hill, up to the top of the pasture. And when they got to the top of that hill, they're all amazed at what they're seeing, the trio of witnesses. But here on the ground, about 250 feet away, is this object. But it's no longer like a sphere, it's like a hemisphere. It's like a big white dome with a flat bottom on the ground or right above the ground. And they estimate this thing's about 100 or so feet in diameter. And it's making that high-pitched sound. It's very bright and luminous. It's lighting up the whole area. And they're all in amazement. And they're sitting there watching this thing. And they're not there too long when one of the other witnesses points out to the fence line, there's a barbed wire fence about 75 feet away. And along that barbed wire fence, here's these 2 creatures slowly walking in their direction. Now, at first, their first thought was they got to be bear. And then they realized that these things the biggest one in front is about 8 foot tall. The other one's about 7 feet tall. And they're moving one behind the other slowly along the fence line. They're tall. They're covered with long, dark, matted hair. They have very long arms almost down to the ground. They have glowing green eyes. There's a smell in the air like burning rubber. And these creatures are making like that baby crying sound, like a whining sound. And they're walking in their direction, one after the other, and one boy gets really, really upset at some point. He runs out of the field. And finally, the other one wants to shoot him. So the fella, the farmer's son, the bigger fella, the older guy, he fires a shot, which was just a tracer. So it's just that bright flash of light. And he fires a second tracer. And when he fires that second tracer, the largest of the 2 creature makes a whining sound and then reaches out as though to grab at that tracer. And at the exact moment that it does that, the object in the field vanishes. It doesn't take off. It's just gone. It disappears. The light's gone. The sound is gone. The object's gone. And at that point, the creatures turn around and started walking along the fence line back towards the woods from where they apparently came. And at that point, he fires some live ammo into him, and this fellow's been hunting for years, and he said, he watched these things, and he could see in their green eyes staring at him. And he's shooting at them, and he said he's sure that he hit the largest one with no doubt, but there was no indication from either creatures that they were slowed down or hurt in any manner. And at that point, they both run out of the field. And they go back to their truck, go back to the farmhouse, tell the family what happened, took them to a neighbor's, and they called the state police. So it's about 45 minutes later when the state trooper arrives on the scene, and I'm here to investigate the flying saucer, and the witness just says, well, look, just forget about it. You're going to think I'm crazy. And the trooper said, I have to investigate the report because we had a report of 2 similar creatures up on the mountain the night before. So they go up in the patrol car, and what the trooper told me was they went over to the area where the object had been, and that whole area was self-luminescent and glowing, about 100 to 150 feet in diameter. But the farm animals wouldn't go anywhere near it. He said if he had a newspaper, he could have sat down within it and read from the light coming off that glowing area, read the newspaper print. And there's a lot more to the story, but it just goes on. And again, it's detailed in the Silent Invasion book. And that was the case that we really did a lot of investigation. And we came to the understanding, or not even the understanding, but we came to the fact that there's a lot more to the UFO and Bigfoot mystery than we had any idea of. Why would there be Bigfoots in the field at the same time with UFO and vice versa? And other reports began to come to our attention as well. And, as the cases began to unfold, and we had our teams out there, other strange things began to happen. I mean, there was indications of whether it was the government or somebody else having interest in some of these cases. We had trails of footprints, for example, that just suddenly stopped and disappeared when there should have been more tracks. A lot of other type of strange events began to unfold, being reported by different people during that time period, and it was just an amazing time. But we began to ask the same questions as a lot of the skeptics do about Bigfoot. If these things really exist, why isn't there more physical evidence? Not that we recommend anybody shooting at it, but why hasn't somebody shot one? Why hasn't somebody hit one with a car? Why hasn't somebody found a body after so many reports year after year, not only in the United States but throughout the world, of something similar? And then we had an instance of a case that happened in February of 1974, which provided maybe a clue as to why we don't have any bodies. And I don't know if you want to go in to discuss that now or not.
Oh, yeah, that'd be fine. There was one thing I would like to mention real quick, because I was reading this in Nick Redfern's latest book, Keep Out, that he's theorized amongst some other people that perhaps some of this could be our actual government or military that's manufacturing this stuff for the the benefit of any spectator as kind of a cover story to cover the new craft that's coming out, in other words.
You talk about some of the UFO cases?
Yeah.
Okay. As I mentioned, I couldn't hear somewhere you're saying. Can you repeat that again?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I forgot about what you said about your ear. I apologize for that. But, yeah, I was just thinking that Nick Redfern in his newest book, Keep Out, was talking about that there was a possibility that some people with the military could be putting on UFO shows and maybe even Bigfoot shows for the benefit of spectators to keep people's attention on that rather than on new military vehicles. It's, being, manufactured in the area. For example, anywhere in the area where your sightings are at, are there any underground bases you might know of?
You hear rumors of these type of things, but nothing I'm aware of. Of course, there is allegedly various underground installations in different parts of the country. We know, of course, some of them do exist, but nothing that I can think of that would stand out in that area. And I can tell you, not just in 73, but literally the thousands of cases I've investigated now in the past 52 years in Pennsylvania, year after year. And, of course, I'll say right from the beginning, and I should tell you this, of all the cases I've investigated, a high percentage of cases, when you look into any phenomena, are generally determined to be either man-made or natural origin. However, there are cases you cannot easily dismiss. In all the years I've been doing this, I've never personally seen a UFO or Bigfoot. I've seen lots of evidence. I've talked to thousands of witnesses. I don't have the answers to what's going on, but something's going on out there. But I also will tell you that many of these really detailed, and there have been hundreds of very detailed UFO cases I've investigated, not lights in the sky, but very close-up observations. It's very difficult for me to believe that the government, and we're going back now to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, up to present day, that the government would be testing experimental craft so frequently over highly populated areas year after year. It just doesn't make sense when they have specific areas where you have restricted airspace, of course, like in California and Nevada, for them to do this type of test flying. So I really don't believe that a lot of the things people are seeing in Pennsylvania might be attributed to that.
Okay, it was just an idea. I thought I'd investigate the angle to see if there's any possibility or not. I was also thinking about the possibility that perhaps if these were, say, from extraterrestrial origins, perhaps they had some kind of holographic technology that was maintaining their ship where it was at so it could disappear, or at least appear to disappear, suddenly when that one Bigfoot-like creature reached out for that flash, in other words, or that tracer, in other words.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's lots of theories. As I said many, many times on many shows and programs, I was out there as an investigator. I was gathering information. I believe a lot of these reports were legitimate cases from that time period, but I don't have the answers as to what was going on.
Right.
What connection, if any, direct connection exists between UFOs and Bigfoot? I don't have the answers. The point is, cases exist, and not just in Pennsylvania. I can tell you, And this is things that going on for years and years, especially back in those days. You know, those who investigate Bigfoot cases generally, even though I see the attitude change in more recent years on this, but back in those days particularly, a lot of the Bigfoot people did not want to hear of anything about UFO sightings be associated with a Bigfoot.
Yeah.
And those in the UFO field didn't want to connect UFOs with Bigfoot. And that wasn't my position to try to figure out what was, I mean, I was out trying to figure out what was going on. I didn't have the answers, but I felt it was too important just to hide it, pretend these cases didn't exist. And I had many investigators from both fields privately contact me and tell me about the fact that they were aware of similar cases in other parts of the country and even out of the country, but many of them were reluctant to publish their cases because they were afraid of being ridiculed from their associates. And, you know, I've tried to get this information out over the years, and I felt that's why I published this book last year, because I felt that there was so much that I never really talked about during that series of events that was so important, so strange and unusual, but it was so important that I couldn't just pretend it didn't occur. And so anyhow, that's one of the reasons why I brought this information out, so people can learn more about it, and hopefully more people who may have similar information may come forward so we can learn more about what we're dealing with.
Yeah, that would help if more people would come forward. What was this other case that you were fixing to tell me about before I asked the questions?
Well, you know, as I said, we always wondered, you know, why hasn't there been any bodies found? And the skeptics, of course, have asked the same thing for years, and I've got to ask the same questions myself. Why didn't we have any bodies after so many reports? So on February 6th of 1974, back up in the mountains of Fayette County again, interesting time period. Those who were living back at that time will recall that when this was happening, there was a national trucker strike. There was gas rationing going on. There was some shootings on the highways across the country. And in Pennsylvania, the National Guard was patrolling with the state police. So in this particular event, you had National Guardians and state police who responded to this incident. And I couldn't get up to the scene early the next morning because I couldn't get gas down here. And what we found out was I went up and interviewed those involved the next morning, myself and one of my other investigators, and we met with a animal control officer up in that county as well. And what we learned was that evening, this was a woman who lived out in the country all her life. She knew animals well. She was pretty much not afraid of anything, lived in a little cabin up in the mountains, and that evening she heard a commotion on her porch of her little cabin home. And there had been a pack of wild dogs had been coming through. She figured these dogs were back because she was hearing there was some garbage out there, some cans out on the porch, and she heard the rattling of cans and figured the dogs were back. So she decided to load her shotgun. She loaded one chamber of her shotgun, and she was going to fire right over the head of the dogs just to scare them off. So she loads her shotgun, and then she walks over to the door. She turns on the light switch. She opens up the door. She walks out on the porch, but there's no dogs. But right there in front of her, just a few feet away, and I remember exactly what she said to me. She never said, I saw a Bigfoot. She said it was a great big hairy ape. There was this huge hairy creature with his arms straight up over its head right in front of her. So what her reaction is? She fires right into it. And when she pulls the trigger and fires, she says there's this real bright flash of light, like somebody took a picture from a camera, and the creature vanishes right in front of her. It's gone. So her family lived about 100 feet away, and they heard the gunshot. So they called over and asked her what happened. And she tried to explain to him. So the son-in-law grabs his pistol, and he began to make his way up to her home. And he said he was surrounded by, I believe, 4 or 5, what he said, like hairy people with eyes like coals of fire. And he started shooting at him and ran into the cabin. And at the same time, here's this large object with different colored lights. He said, like a big Christmas ornament hovering over the woods at the same time. Now, they were pretty shook up, so they called the state police. And these people had a lot of animals up there, including a number of dogs. And I talked to the investigating officer, and he said he said, I don't know what happened. He said, by the time we got up there, he said everything was gone. But he said how the animals reacted was just unbelievable. It was the strangest thing he'd ever seen. He said there was, I think one was Eskimo Spitz, maybe a German Shepherd, and a couple he said there was one of these big dogs was in a cage, and he said he reached inside that cage, and he tried to pull that dog out, and that dog should have ripped his hand off. Dog wouldn't bark, wouldn't move, just shivering and shaking, just scared to death, and it just did not act normal at all. And he said it was just unbelievable how all the dogs were like that, and all the animals up there, you could see how they were reacting to something really, really scared the dogs and the animals up there. And that's something you couldn't fabricate. And when we were up there the next morning, we were investigating and looking around the air. We went out in the woods, and we found the BB pattern right in line in a tree out there in the woods, right in line where the lady shot at the creature from her Porsche. So if the story is true, and I felt no reason for these people to fabricate such a story, and they seem to be very legitimate, then here was a clue as to maybe why we don't have any bodies of these things. That we might be dealing with something that's not, looks like a flesh and blood animal, but there might be some other characteristics to it. And, you know, the Native Americans have said for years that these creatures are much more spiritual in nature, and maybe they're closer to the truth than we think they are.
It wouldn't make a lot of sense if that was the case. And I've heard similar from a friend and a fellow radio show host that I know named Thomas Hughes, and from Lapicertus Jack as well, which he's got a new book out on that himself. But, yeah, I've heard people that's connected the UFO and the Bigfoot before, and I know that I've had people on that claim to have channeled material from the Pleiades, and they're supposed to be a spiritual group. Is there any way to know or find out whether or not Bigfoot could come from that area? Who knows?
Well, we actually don't have that information. I mean, again, you know, we're out there gathering data, trying to find information on what these things might be, and going in looking for all years and years, thinking these things are some type of unknown primate. And then we came up with a series of events that happened in the 70s that gave us a whole different perspective as to what we might be dealing with. And, I mean, since that time, I mean, we have Bigfoot sightings here in Pennsylvania year after year, and many of these are very, very detailed accounts. And that other report I had on Really Mysterious Pennsylvania, we had some very, very close-up, very detailed, you know, daylight encounters with Bigfoot type creatures. And, you know, again, we have footprints, you know, we gather over the air from casts. And it was interesting that while here in Pennsylvania, you have your typical five-toed footprint, a lot of the reports we had, especially during the 70s, were three-toed footprints. But again, a lot of people may not be aware that around in the Pacific Northwest, other parts of the country, we have your typical five-toed tracks. You also occasionally have three-toed and even four-toed footprints showing up. So there's a lot of mystery here is what we're dealing with. It's hard enough to believe we're dealing with one type of unknown specimen. And what are we dealing with? If some of these other tracks are legit, as some of the ones we have in Pennsylvania, which we believe probably are, but they don't fit into those categories of your so-called typical Bigfoot tracks.
And then the other factor is if they're not solid, how are they leaving footprints? Or can they become solid if they choose?
Well, again, some of the cases seem to suggest that we're dealing with a phenomenon that has both a physical and a non-physical aspect to it.
Right. That's an interesting thought. Got to be, you know, you'd think it'd have some kind of form of astral projection involved in it. I've actually heard of bilocation before. I don't know if you imagine you probably have too, and I don't know if there's any connection between that or not.
Well, again, there's a lot of ideas, a lot of theories, and there are so many strange things that have shown up in some of these cases over the years. And it just makes you wonder what's going on. I mean, back in those days, too, I mean, there was some indication that there was some government interest in some of these events. That one particular case up in Uniontown, we talked about October 25th of 73, because of some of the events that we didn't really get into on the program here, but I discussed in more detail, we did not do any hypnosis with that one of the key witnesses. And many years later, because we attempted to try to follow up with different witnesses over the years in some of these cases, especially that case because it was so important. And many years after that event happened, one of my associates and I went up to interview the key witness. And many years later, we thought of maybe the possibility of using hypnosis at that point, and we're talking to the witness about it, and he said, why do you want to hypnotize me again? And we said, well, what are you talking about? And he said, well, you guys already hypnotized me. And I said, well, we never hypnotized you. And he went on to tell us that back in 73, probably a week or two after this happened, and we had been up there numerous times, after that event, that two men came to his home, which he always thought they were part of our group, our research group. But one was in a suit and one was in an Air Force uniform. And the one fellow had a briefcase with him. And in that briefcase, they took out several photographs for him to look at, both of UFOs and also Bigfoot. And as I recall, the witness told me one of the Bigfoot pictures, the Bigfoot climbing over a fence with a pig under his arm, and I believe he said it was taken in Georgia. And they wanted to know if any of these pictures looked similar to what he had seen. And then they asked him permission if they would hypnotize him, which apparently they did. And at that point, they left, and they said they would be in touch, and he never heard from those people again. Now, who they were, of course, we have no idea.
Okay. Now, are you by any chance using a cell phone for this show?
No, I'm not on a cell phone.
Okay, I just wondered because a couple of times now, it was like your voice got way slowed down. I thought maybe you had a weak signal coming across your phone or something, so I thought I'd check.
Okay, hold on. See if this is any better.
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Okay, I'm on a different phone now.
Oh, okay. Anyway, I thought I'd mention it because it, like I say, happened twice, and I didn't know if you was aware of it or not. But now another question I have for you is on the Kecksburg UFO, was there any kind of, say, Bigfoot activity associated with it at any point in time?
No, it's a case into itself. It's I've interviewed hundreds of people who have direct or indirect knowledge about the case, and for those who aren't familiar with it, that was back December 9th of 1965. And, we could talk for days about the Kecksburg case. And very interesting report. Multitudes of eyewitnesses reporting seeing this bright, fiery object moving across the sky over a large distance over several states and coming in over the greater Pittsburgh area and then moving out into Westmoreland County, where I'm at. And as this thing came in over the Pittsburgh area late that afternoon, it was just getting dark, and people were calling in because some people thought that what they saw was an airplane on fire. And so the police departments, the radio stations, the news media were being overwhelmed with reports coming in. And that evening, I happened to be tuned into KDK Radio in Pittsburgh because they were going to be talking about strange events and flying saucers, because on this talk show it's called Contact, and Mike Levine was the host, and he had a guest named Frank Edwards, who you may recognize. He had written some books on strange happenings. And I tuned in, of course, to listen to Frank Edwards that evening. And basically the focus of the program was on all these multiple reports of this UFO that had been seen over the greater Pittsburgh area. And they were interviewing witnesses. They were reading the newswire stories coming in about it. And as the evening went on, reports came in that whatever that object was, it apparently had fallen into a wooded area out in Westmoreland County, about 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh or so. And anyhow, the reports got much more intriguing because reports were that the military was now arriving in that farming community to search for the object. And it was an interesting evening. I was running back and forth between TV and radio trying to get the latest information. I wasn't driving yet and had no way to get out there. And the next day, it was the major headline story in most all the local papers and making national news. And there were a number of very interesting stories. But the second edition of the Greensburg Tribune Review had one of the stories basically indicated there was a search, but nothing had been found. That apparently from the authorities, that the report was that people had apparently seen a bright meteor in the sky, but that nothing had fallen to the ground, and the search uncovered absolutely nothing in the woods. And officially, that's how the story remains today. And I was, again, quite young. There was very little information at that time. I began to try to follow up with some of the people up in that area right after it happened, but got not much information. But there was a lot of people back then, and right at that time, indicating that late that night, which was actually early the next morning, people had seen a large military flatbed tractor trailer truck carrying a large tarped object out of the area at a high rate of speed. And I pursued the case as best I could. There was not a lot of information to go on, but over weeks and months and years, various people, neighbors, relatives of people who were involved, friends, people who were involved, began to contact me and gave me more and more information, which suggested there was a lot more to the story. And in 1987, I was holding one of my big public UFO displays at the local Westmoreland Mall, which brought in literally thousands of people. We had a very, very big exhibit for the public, and it brought a tremendous number of people in. And it was a great place to gather information because so many people who had sightings and never reported it came to us and gave us their details. And we didn't have a lot on Kecksburg at that time, but we had a little display, and one of my associates there talking to another man about it, and I was out for lunch, I believe, and man and his family happened to walk by, and he was listening to the conversation. He broke in and said, "Were you talking about the thing that happened in Kecksburg?" And my associate said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I was on the search team that found the object." And, of course, his eyes and ears perked up, and they got a hold of me. And the guy said, "Look, I'll tell you about it, but I don't want involved. I don't want my family involved." And he agreed to meet with us at another time and gave us a detailed account of what happened that night and how he got involved. And he was not from Kecksburg himself. But what he told us was that he was a part of a volunteer fire department not that far away from that area that were called out with others to assist for a search of a possible downed aircraft in that area. And he described how he went out to the area with one of his fire units and a few guys and met a lot of other fellows out there he didn't know. And they broke up into different teams, and they got in the trucks, and they left them up in different areas. They were going to conduct a search up in that wooded area. They had walkie-talkies, and they weren't out there very long when they got a radio call that one of the other teams had come across the object. So they hurried over to that area, and they're down in the middle of this wooded ravine, and are standing on this little embankment looking down this thing, which is only a few feet away. And what they're seeing was not a meteorite. It was not an aircraft. They expect to find a downed aircraft, and he said this was unlike anything they had ever seen before. And this one witness, that turned out to be Jim Romansky. He had been a machinist basically all of his life, and he said to him, he said the best way to describe it, he said it looked like somebody took liquid metal and poured it into an acorn-shaped mold. He said there was no rivets, no seam, no weld marks, no fuselage. It looked like a great big metallic acorn, kind of an off-gold bronze color. And on the back part of the raised-up area, like where the acorn, the back of it, he called it the bumper area. There were these raised-up markings that he said looked more like symbols. And he said they weren't down there very long when two men in trench coats came down through the woods and told them the area was all quarantined and you guys got to get out of the area right now. And right behind the two guys in the trench coats are soldiers coming down through the woods. And he said they were so close to each other that they were shining their flashlights on each other. And so that was in 1987. Now, what was interesting, Jim was not from Kecksburg again. He hadn't been out in that area since 1965. But he agreed to go out to the area. Well, we did. There was a lot of things we knew that we did not tell him. You know, there was this large wooded area, and up to that point, we never had any eyewitnesses that actually saw the object. It's just indication something was down and was taken out, but nobody knew. But during the 80s, we began to get a lot more information on the case. We began to intensify our investigation. And while we were out there searching in the 80s, we found what appeared to be a pattern of tree damage, where trees were knocked down in the same direction, top of trees were broken out. And we got a pretty good idea where something probably had fallen along that trajectory path. But we didn't tell him. So we met him out in that area. It's a very, very large wooded area. There were certain landmarks and details that he kind of recalled from that night. So he walked around it for quite a while. We mentioned nothing to him. And after quite a while, he said, "You know what, guys? I think we're right on the spot." And my associate and I looked at each other because that was right in the immediate vicinity where we thought the thing had probably come down. And the next year, we got a tip that a local man, that turned out to be Bill Bullybush, had been one of the first down at the scene right after it had fallen. And he never came forward, as so many witnesses didn't. We had to track them down because they weren't willing to come forward for various reasons. And he verified that, he had been down there and seen the object. So we got a hold of him, and he confirmed it. So he took us down from a completely different vantage point than what Jim did. And we walked down this high hill, way down through the woods, across the fields, on the other side of the woods. And he said that what his story was, he was over in Mammoth, which is right over the hill from Kecksburg that afternoon. He was under the dash, tuning up a CB radio, when he saw the object coming across the sky from the village of Norvell, moving out towards the mountains out towards Laurelville. And he said he ran out on the road and watched this thing as it moved out towards the mountains, and it kind of hesitated, made a turn, and began to track back towards Kecksburg. So he jumped into his car. It went on top of the highest point, which they now have changed the name of the road to Media Road. And he could see down in those woods. He said it looked like blue sparklers, like kids playing with sparklers. And he knew that shouldn't have been down there because he hunted down in those woods. So it was getting dark. He had a flashlight. He began to make his way down to the bottom of the wooded area. And so he took us down. He told us how he went over. And as he got over, he stood behind a particular tree and saw the object which had impacted into the ground. And he pointed to us, and it was the exact same place that Jim took us to a year before, but from a different vantage point. And since that time, we've talked to other witnesses who apparently saw the object. What we now know that after that object fell, apparently a number of independent people went down into the woods, including children, to see what had fallen. And some apparently got very close to whatever this thing was. And a lot of these people, unfortunately, are no longer with us. We got details of some family members. We've talked to other witnesses who apparently were down in the woods and did see the object. And there are so many different amazing stories from that night, because after this event began to unfold, this was being broadcast on radio stations all around Pittsburgh. It was a big news story, and hundreds of people descended on the small farming community that night to try to see what this thing was. Not only the public, but you had reporters from all the major Pittsburgh radio, newspapers, TV stations there. And many of those reporters verified that there was a military presence at the scene. And again, nobody was allowed down into the woods to get anywhere near what the object was. Well, a lot of these people were on a winding, narrow farm road that paralleled along the one edge of this large wooded area. What they didn't know was that the object actually had fallen way on the opposite side down in the wooded ravine. And over on that opposite side was this dirt farm lane that various people, small number of people, found their way onto that night, and that's where most of the military activity was taking place. And we have various stories from different people, very interesting for so many independent people who saw the military there and military trucks and what was taking place. And a number of people, a lot of teenagers we talked to were out there that night, and some of them tried to sneak down into the woods from different areas and were stopped by armed military people or soldiers down in the woods. But also intriguing is the fact that several independent people have gone publicly on record and said that they were stopped by armed military personnel who aimed their weapons at them. Now, here you have soldiers on other people's private property preventing other civilians from going down into the woods. And all these years, nobody's ever found where that jurisdiction came from for them to have that type of authority to do that. And in the summer of 1990, before Unsolved Mysteries did a season premiere on the case, I was contacted by a gentleman whose background I could check out, and he told me that he was a part of the Air Force security team that guarded the object from Pennsylvania that came into Lockbourne Air Force Base near Columbus, Ohio, during the early morning hours of December 10th. And he told us how they brought that vehicle in that flatbed tractor trailer in a way that they generally don't enter that complex. Another person independently verified the same story. They backed it into a hangar, and he said the security on the base was even higher than when President Kennedy had visited her before. He said they were given a shoot-to-kill order to anybody who approached that hangar without the proper authority.
Wow.
Now, he told me he wasn't on that security team that long, but he heard it went from there over to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And other independent witnesses verified us what building they took the object to as well. So where it's at today, of course, we don't know. And what the object was is still open to speculation. Because whatever that thing was, I mean, it was relatively large. They estimated, from what they could tell, was buried in the ground. It was probably about 10 to 12 feet or more in length, about 8 to 10 feet in diameter. It was big enough for a human to be inside of. And as this object was coming in, it made turns along the path, and it made a slow descent. Those people saw it go down said it didn't come down at a high rate of speed, like a reentry of space debris or a meteor, but it came in relatively slow, and moments after it fell, there was a column of blue smoke that went up, but it dissipated very quickly. And so there's been many, many theories as to what this thing was, but everybody, who was involved, and many even today, after 46 years, still ask, why won't the government really tell us what was found that night?
Yeah, the same way with Roswell and the Aurora Roswell, and I think the other one is Bentwaters and Shag Arbor, and they're all being, nobody wants to tell you anything, in other words.
Yeah. Well, I actually, back a number of years ago, I produced a documentary, won a film award, called Kecksburg the Untold Story. It's on DVD, and it, along with my books, is available at my website, which is stangordon.info. And if people want to get a personalized autographed copy of the book, they can order it directly through my website, or, of course, they can go to Amazon as well.
Speaking about your book, I was going to say we're getting close to the end of the show. I was going to see you wanted to real quick, tell my listeners about your two books, Silent Invasion and the Northern Pennsylvania. Well, I'm having trouble reading that other title.
It's the other book. It's Silent Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot Case Book. And that's the big book that focuses on that massive wave of strange events of 1973 and 74, which I can tell you some of the strangest cases on record you'll read in that book. And then Really Mysterious Pennsylvania has a lot of very close-up, detailed encounters with UFOs, Bigfoot, other strange creatures like giant birds they call thunderbirds, black panthers, other mysterious creatures. And so it's got a lot of fascinating cases, which I investigated here in Pennsylvania as well. And you can get personalized autographed copies through my website, or you can order through Amazon as well.
Okay. And the website is www.stangordon.info. And also for you people that's listening at Shoutcast or YouTube or one of the other locations of my show, the address for my site is www.paranormalpalace.com. And you can come here and catch all my future shows live, and you can join in the chat room. And I didn't mention it during the show. I usually do, that my call-in number's 832-632-7904. I kind of got carried away there, and I forgot to mention it, folks, and now we're at the end, and I apologize for that. Also, I want to invite everybody to stop by United Paranormal International. It's got a bunch of researchers from around the world into all kinds of different paranormal phenomena. It's a social network and a great place to meet people of a like mind and to learn. So, Stan, have you got any, upcoming events that you can tell us about that we may not know about?
Well, of course, the end of the year now we're here, so there's not much going on right now. But next year, there's a lot of events that are being discussed, and I'll be at quite a number of different conferences next year. So I'd recommend just go to my website, stangordon.info, and over next weeks or months, we'll begin to post some of the events for 2012 coming up.
Well, that sounds like a winner. Folks, I want to thank you for coming and listening. Couldn't have a show without you any more than I could without my guests. And I'm going to go ahead and call this in here a wrap and go spend some time with my wife. Stan, it's been a pleasure having you, and I'd love to have you back on the show in the future.
We appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. You have a good day.
You too. Good night.